Coming up on Network Africa. Sudan protests continue for second day after Monday's coup, with at least 7 people reportedly killed and dozens injured. Mali expels ECOWAS envoy amid pressure over elections. Plus, Egypt's leader, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, lifts a state of emergency that's been in place for 4 years. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Tenyola Shoboale. We begin with updates from Sudan following Monday's coup that has received international condemnation. Crowds of angry Sudanese citizens have continued to protest through the night against the military action. At least 7 people were reported killed and dozens injured, many of them as a result of soldiers opening fire on protesters. The United Nations is demanding that the military release the Prime Minister, Abdallah Hamdok, and other civilian leaders of the transitional government as the Security Council holds an emergency session on Tuesday. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan said he has been keeping the deposed civilian Prime Minister Hamdok in his house for his safety, but that he would return to his home on Tuesday. In the days before the coup, Mr. Hamdok warned of a dangerous crisis after one faction in the transitional government called for the military to take over. Meanwhile, the U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, is the latest Western leader to call for the immediate restoration of Sudan's civilian rule without preconditions. In reaction to the coup, America has now halted $700 million in direct aid to Sudan's government and called for the release of detained civilian leaders.
Global powers continue to condemn the military coup in Sudan as protesters are not backing down on their demonstration in the capital, Khartoum, calling on security forces to release those who were detained unlawfully. On Monday, the U.S. State Department released a joint statement co-signed by the UK and Norway. A department spokesperson added it was pausing $7 million in economic aid to Sudan after the country's military seized power from a transitional government earlier in the day.
Any change to the transitional government by force risks assistance in our bilateral relationship more broadly. In light of these developments, the United States is pausing assistance from the $700 million in emergency assistance appropriations of economic support funds for Sudan. Those funds were intended to support the country's democratic transition as we evaluate the next step for Sudan programming.
Britain calls the coup an unacceptable betrayal of the Sudanese people and called on security forces there to release the country's Prime Minister, Abdallah Hamdok.
The UK most strongly condemns the arrests of civilian members of Sudan's transitional government by the military today. We are also deeply concerned by reports of shooting of protesters. This must stop. Over the past 2 years, Sudan has been on the delicate pathway from oppressive autocratic rule towards freedom and democracy. The UK has been a consistent and firm advocate for the democratic transition since the 2019 revolution. The acts of the military today represent an unacceptable betrayal of the Sudanese people and their journey to democracy.
Clashes broke out on Monday between soldiers and street protesters. Health officials said several people were killed by gunfire. Al-Tayyib Mohammed Ahmed was among a crowd of young people who barricaded streets in protest.
They fired stun grenades. Then they fired live ammunition. 2 people died. I saw them with my own eyes. Then they came back twice and killed one more. This is the 3rd one I saw.
Sudan had been on the edge since a failed coup plot only a month before. Military and civilian groups have been sharing power following the topple of the autocratic leader Omar al-Bashir 2 years ago. The military was meant to hand over power to an elected figure in the coming months, but on Monday, coup leader General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan dissolved the Sovereign Council, declared a state of emergency, and promised to hand over power to an elected body in 2023. Diplomats said the UN Security Council was likely to discuss Sudan behind closed doors.
Joining us now is Alistair Wilcox, African Affairs Analyst, for more on this. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Oh, yeah, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
So let's take a look at the latest developments. The U.S. says it's halting $700 million direct aid, which is a much-needed aid for the country. What do you make of this? Is this likely to change anything?
Well, I do not, in all honesty, think withholding of $700 million aid to the government will change anything drastically. No. It's not unexpected that the U.S. will react that way, because that's, of course, that's the first thing they will do. Like the spokesperson was talking about the aid meant for assisting the democratic march structure of the country. So it is not unexpected that that fund will be withheld, because for what it's meant for, which is for the democratization of Sudan, has been pushed on hold. So that's, for me, it's a not natural thing. And of course, the coup leaders will not be oblivious of the fact that the U.S. will support them with any fund. So that, for me, may not be the necessary pressure, that will be brought to bear to the coup leaders, so that they might have a change of path. So it's not unexpected. Naturally, leaders across the world will always want to suspend, not cancel, suspend such aid. But I think I'm more at home with what the British African minister said. Sudan in the last 2 years has been on a very critical path, and that has been on the very, very much international radar as to how they progress since the ouster of Omar al-Bashir. It's been a worrisome concern, and everybody across the world has had very special interest in Sudan. So if this is happening, then there should be something more drastic to be done than just withholding of aid.
And also, as expected, the UN Security Council is holding a meeting over this issue. What approach do you think should be taken that will help Sudan back on track to civilian rule?
Well, not once, not twice that the United Nations Security Council has discussed Sudan. Even when al-Bashir was in power, Sudan has always been in the forefront of the United Nations Security Council decisions. They've had so many decisions, even up to the point of sending peacekeepers and troops into Sudan and all whatnot. So it's a regular customer to the United Nations Security Council. Right now, what anybody will expect in order to bring about sanity in Sudan is for a multinational approach to the solving of the issues, whereby all the powers that be will have a common front in dealing with the issue. It may not be an armed conflict or an armed intervention, but something in the neighborhood of strong economic sanctions targeted against the government by all parties on the Security Council and all parties across the world. Right now, Sudan, the coup leaders are taking Sudan backward. There's supposed to be election in a few months' time, and the coup leader is talking about 2023. That means they want to perpetuate themselves in office. And if you consider what Sudan has gone through in the hands of al-Bashir, that held forth for so long and has brought so much misery on the people, nobody will want any military junta to hold sway in Sudan. The current arrangement that was just truncated is a partnership between the military and the civilian, for which an elected civilian government was supposed to take in office in a few months' time. And for somebody to wake up and to truncate it is taking the country backward, and nobody can tell the future. So it's going to be a multilateral approach by the Security Council with sound and strong economic sanctions, military sanctions, political military sanctions against, in fact, to turn them to a federal state whereby they will not be able to go outside Khartoum, being confined only to Khartoum until they see reasons to relinquish whatever misadventure they have against Sudanese people.
And just to look at, Sudan's neighbors, what role do you think regional powers have to play in this, after all the usual condemnation?
Well, it's really regional powers are toothless bulldog. I've always said that, especially within the African region, the Maghreb. I mean, they belong to the Maghreb region, and I don't know how strong their coalition is. And because in that region, it is the democratic structures are very weak, and we have more of authoritarian rules. So there may not be too much of intervention from their neighbors. But I think Africa as a whole, it's time Africa stands up because this is becoming one coup too many in Africa, one coup too many. And with this scenario, we thought that we have seen the last of coups in Africa. But with what is happening today in Sudan, that has replicated itself in other countries like Mali, like Burkina Faso or thereabouts, I think there is now a new vista that people are thinking, adventurers are not thinking that they can go ahead and bring down democratically elected government, and what you get is just condemnation. I think this Sudanese experience should serve as should be used as a test case to know if coups are becoming fashionable again. But I think in the last 10, 15 years or thereabouts, coups were made not to be fashionable, and everybody was behaving itself. But with what has happened recently, I think it's time that a second look is looked at what is going on. Their neighbors may not do much. They are all authoritarian regimes within and around the Maghreb region where Sudan falls into. So I don't expect much to happen. If maybe they are within the West African sub-region, I could have said, okay, maybe something more serious could have taken place. But within that region, they are all authoritarian governments, and democracy is almost like very weak or alien to them. So they might not just have too much interest. But at the same time, it's time for an entire world to stand, the entire Africa to stand. What is happening in Sudan today is capable of turning back the little stability that has been established since the ouster of Omar Bashir. The little stability that has been established, and the movement towards democratic credentials and democratic culture in Sudan it's about to be truncated, and the world should not allow that to happen.
Certainly, Mr. Alistair Wilcox, thank you so much for your thoughts on the program.
It's always my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And over in Mali, the country has expelled the ECOWAS regional bloc's representative in the country as pressure mounts on it to provide a final timeline on its transition to civilian rule. A statement on state-run RTM TV says Omadou Boli was summoned by the Foreign Affairs Ministry and notified of the government's decision in view of his actions that is described as incompatible with his status. Mali has been at loggerheads with the regional body over demands to hold elections in February. The West African nation was suspended from ECOWAS in May after the interim leader, Colonel Assimi Goïta, carried out a second coup in less than a year. Prime Minister Choguel Maïga has indicated that the election could be delayed, citing concerns over credibility. The Southern African Regional Bloc, SADC, has called for the unconditional and immediate lifting of all sanctions against the Zimbabwean government. A statement by Malawi President Lazarus Chakwera, who is the chairperson of the organization that brings together 16 countries, says SADC is concerned by the continuation of sanctions on some individuals or entities of Zimbabwe. Mr. Chakwera said the prolonged sanctions have hindered Zimbabwe's prospects of economic recovery, human security, and sustainable growth. Zimbabwe has been under economic sanctions from the US and EU, targeting specific individuals and companies, which the government blames for the country's economic problems. The SADC statement said Zimbabwe and the regional bloc were committed to talks with the relevant players to enhance democracy, governance, and human rights. The EU and the US have cited a lack of progress in democratic and human rights reforms, as well as restrictions on press freedoms. Still to come on the program. Local artists are reimagining ancient Egypt with modern, larger-than-life exhibitions of sculptures like Giza pyramids. That's in a moment. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. A South African judge has dismissed an application by former President Jacob Zuma to have the state prosecutor in his arms deal corruption trial removed from the case. Mr. Zuma, who was ousted by the governing African National Congress in 2018, had argued that the prosecutor was biased against him and submitted a special plea to the Pietermaritzburg High Court to have him replaced. The 79-year-old has pleaded not guilty to charges of corruption, money laundering and racketeering related to a 1990s deal to buy military equipment. He was jailed earlier this year for contempt of court for refusing to appear at a separate investigation, but he was later released on medical parole after being hospitalized for an undisclosed condition.
Or doctors of the state's choice to determine whether he is fit to attend court and stand trial. My clarification of that order is contained in paragraph 200. The written judgment accordingly concludes with the following order being granted. 1. The special plea is dismissed. 2. The matter is directed to proceed to trial in respect of the not guilty pleas of Mr. Zuma and Thales.
And to security matters, the authorities in Uganda say a suicide bomber is behind an explosion on a bus in the capital Kampala on Monday. According to police spokesperson Fred Enanga, the attacker died in the explosion. He adds that the attacker was on a wanted list and was a member of the Islamist militant group Allied Democratic Forces, which operates from neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. Several passengers were injured in Monday's blast. On Saturday, another blast in a restaurant in Kampala killed one person and injured 3 others. The police said Saturday's blast was caused by an explosive device containing nails and pieces of metal covered by a plastic bag. Mr. Enanga said investigators had established a high connectivity between the 2 attacks. And now, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has announced that he's ending the state of emergency, which has been in force since April 2017 in the North African country. In a Facebook post, President Sisi announced that he would not be extending the state of emergency because Egypt had become an oasis of security and stability. He imposed the strict measure 4 years ago in the aftermath of the bombings of 2 churches in the northern cities of Alexandria and Tanta, giving the police wider powers, curtailed civil liberties, and put civilians on trial before military courts. Let's get more on this story from the VOA's correspondent, Edward Yeranayan. Edward, wow, 4 years. It's a really long time. How are Egyptians reacting to the lifting of this state of emergency?
Yes, Tenny. Well, it's a lot longer than 4 years because since the 1950s, there have only been several brief periods when the state of emergency wasn't imposed. It was initially imposed in 1956, then lifted briefly during the mid-60s, and then reimposed after the 1967 war, and then briefly lifted around 1980, and then former President Hosni Mubarak had imposed it for 30 years in a row. And it was lifted after he was toppled in 2011, and then reimposed twice, once in 2013 briefly, and then again in 2017. So I think most Egyptians look at it as something they've lived through most of their lives, and it really doesn't affect most people. It affects judicial situations and allows people to be tried by courts that are not under the normal jurisdictions.
Yeah, like you said, most Egyptians are kind of used to this, right? But help us understand what would change as a result of this state of emergency being lifted, and what measures are still in place to ensure the security of the country.
Well, first of all, those who were detained under the state of emergency will still be going through the same judicial processes to the same judicial courts. And when this is lifted, there is also a terrorism law that was imposed in around 2015 that would also allow for some situations where people were tried outside the normal judicial settings. So I think in a way, it's for the public to see that things are improving and that many things have gotten back to normal. I mean, if you lived through the situation here in Egypt back in the days after the Arab Spring, after the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, and then after they were ousted, things were quite turbulent and oftentimes violent. So, I mean, things are quite peaceful now, and it's quite a contrast when you see what's happening in Sudan. So I think perhaps visually the president wanted to say, after people were watching what was going on in Sudan, that here we are in Egypt and we're an oasis of stability, which is exactly what he did say.
All right, then, Ed, thank you so much for the update.
My pleasure, Penny.
And elsewhere, Russia's Navy has foiled an attempt by pirates to hijack a Panama-registered container ship off West Africa. The Russian Defense Ministry says the MSC Lucia was en route to Cameroon from Togo when it sent out a distress call on Monday that was picked up by the Russian destroyer Vice Admiral Kulakov. A unit of Russian Marines were dispatched by helicopter to the Lucia's aid. The pirates immediately fled, allowing the Marines to free the ship's crew. The Russian destroyer was patrolling the Gulf of Guinea as part of international efforts to improve security there. The waters off West Africa's oil-rich coastline have been some of the most dangerous in the world for shipping in recent years. Now, the UK 6th Royal Navy ship, the HMS Trent, is in Nigeria for a week of training exercises with Nigerian Navy officials in the fight against piracy in the Gulf of Guinea before continuing their Africa tour to Ghana, the Gambia, Senegal and Cape Verde. Though the 2,000-ton HMS Trent arrived in Nigeria yesterday and docked at the Apapa port, the crew was welcomed by the British Deputy High Commissioner, accompanied by the Deputy Defence Attaché from the UK's Ministry of Defence. Commanding officer of the ship, Tom Knott, was on hand to discuss the operation and further cooperation between the Nigerian and British Ministry regarding maritime security.
We're here for the week, so as we reach the end of this week, we'll be proceeding to sea to the immediate area to work alongside the Nigerian Navy and some of your other law enforcement agencies. So that starts us for this week, and then for the next 3 months, HMS Trent will be deployed to the Gulf of Guinea and West Africa region, where we will visit Ghana, the Gambia, Senegal and Cape Verde. And Senegal is where we'll host the G7++ Friends of Gulf of Guinea. There's a co-chair with Senegal. And that comes back to that last question about what are the broader avenues that we're exploring whilst we're in this region rather than simply military and operational activity. The G7++ has 6 working groups which cover grounds such as financial support to the region, civil society, industry. So it's much broader than military activity, and we're playing our part in that as well. The training activity was your second question, and give you a feel for how this week will pan out. It's a broad range of activity from Royal Marine interdiction training, so our boarding team, who have got a search and seizure capability, so they'll be explaining exactly how they go about doing that. We'll be explaining how we operate a patrol vessel, which we think is ideal for this type of role, maritime security operations in coastal regions. We're a very much modular capability, that means we can bolt on and bolt off pieces of capability that are fit for the task. And you'll see right now you're sat on the flight deck of the ship where, if required, we can embark a helicopter, which are essential for coastal operations as well.
And finally on the programme, local and international artists are exhibiting their work against the backdrop of Egypt's famed Giza pyramids. It's remerging ancient Egyptian history by merging heritage and art. Take a look.
Egyptian Art Initiative, Art d'Egypte, hosted an international ceremony where they showcased international contemporary artwork with a backdrop of the country's famed Giza pyramids, the last remaining wonder of the ancient world. Dubbed Forever is Now, the exhibition was the first of its kind to take place at the Giza Plateau, which today survives as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The exhibition featured artworks by 10 artists, said Art d'Egypte founder Nadine Gaffar, 2 Egyptians and 8 foreigners. Among the artists who showcased their work were famed Italian sculptor and former actor Lorenzo Quinn, American contemporary artist Gisela Colon, Ukrainian visual artist Alexander Ponomarev, and renowned Egyptian painter Mortaz Nasser.
Because of COVID, we've been separated for a year and a half, and humanity is starting to come together again. And it just goes to prove that when we work together, we can achieve anything. And of course, the representation of that is those amazing structures that we have there behind us. 4,500 years later, they're still here.
The exhibition, which kicked off on Thursday, will run until November 7 and is open to the public.
To Egypt or thought about visiting may say, that looks like something I want to see. And I think it will be a draw and it will create a buzz that will help tourism.
Forever is Now is Art d'Egypte's 4th annual exhibition.
And that's the programme today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Tenyola Shoboale.